The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a rhythm that Natalie Hayes had learned to ignore 3 weeks ago. She moved through the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial like water finding its level, efficient, quiet, present without demanding presence. Her scrubs were pressed. Her badge hung at the exact angle that made her visible to patients but invisible to administrators. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the corridors like a permanent patient, and she breathed it in the way combat medics breathe in diesel fuel, without noticing anymore. Room for 07 held a chart that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. The colonel had arrived at 2,156 hours with a diagnosis that made the ER attending grimace. Pericardial effusion. Complex presentation. Multiple comorbidities. The kind of case that looked expensive to treat and profitable only if the patient died quickly enough to avoid litigation. Natalie watched from the nurse's station as the admitting physician, a careful man named Mitchell who ordered every test twice, made phone calls. Then more calls. By 0038, she'd overheard him contact 20 different specialists. 20 doctors. Each one declined. Some politely. Some with the particular cruelty of physicians who'd already decided a patient wasn't worth the risk. Too high risk for our malpractice exposure, she'd heard through the open office door. Complex airway. Complex hemodynamics. I'm not touching it, said another. What's the reimbursement on pericardial effusion in an uninsured military retiree? A pause. Then, yeah. That's what I thought. 20 refusals. Each one a small betrayal dressed in the language of risk management. Natalie had been a nurse for exactly 17 days at Oak Creek Memorial. Before that, she'd lived in an apartment in a city where nobody knew her name, taking per diem shifts at 3 different hospitals, staying invisible the way invisible people stay alive. The way soldiers who've seen too much learn to disappear into civilian spaces. She wore her scrubs like other people wore masks. They fit. They hid everything that mattered. The combat boots sat in her locker at the bottom, under her street clothes. Size 9. Desert tan. The leather creased in places where her feet had moved under fire in Helmand Province 2 decades ago. She touched them sometimes before her shift started, just the toe of one boot with the pad of her index finger, the way someone else might touch a photo. She didn't look at them. She just needed to know they were there. The chart on room for 07 arrived at the nurse's station at 0043. Natalie pulled it without thinking, the way her hands had learned to pull charts without her brain being consulted. Senior Airman Michael Tahir. 51 years old. Admitted with acute pericardial effusion secondary to possible malignancy. Echocardiogram showed fluid accumulation at 4.2 centimeters. The heart was drowning inside its own casing. She read the name and her breath caught. Just once. Just a small interruption in the pattern she'd perfected. She knew that name. She knew the face in the photo clipped to the paperwork, older now, lined in ways that combat and age conspire to create, but the same face. The same Michael Tahir who had been 8 years old in the rubble of a compound in Sanjan Valley, half buried in concrete dust, calling for his mother in Pashto. The boy whose ribs she could count through his skin. The boy she'd carried on her back for 6 kilometers until the extraction birds came down. The boy she'd petitioned the Navy to help her adopt through military channels because his family was gone and his village was gone and he had nothing left but the memory of someone's hands pulling him from the dark. Her hands, as it turned out. She put the chart back in its holder with the same careful precision she applied to everything. No tremor. No reaction visible on her face. She had learned that skill in a different uniform, under different lights, when other people's lives had depended on her being absolutely still inside while chaos moved through the world around her. The night shift supervisor, a woman named Carlton who'd worked ER nursing for 34 years, leaned against the counter drinking cold coffee from a mug that said, "I survived the night shift." 20 doctors, Carlton said quietly, not looking at Natalie. 20. I've never seen that before. Mitchell finally gave up. Said it's a comfort care situation now. Wait for family, make him comfortable, let it happen. How long? Natalie asked. Her voice was steady. That was the important part, the steadiness. 48 hours. Maybe 72 if we're lucky. Heart's drowning in its own fluid. Without intervention, without the right procedure to decompress the sac, he's on a countdown. Carlton finally looked over. You want to take that room? I can reassign you. No, Natalie said. I'll take it. The thing about Dr. Hargrove was that he noticed things. Not the things that mattered. He'd never noticed that Carlton had been a Navy wife once, or that Mitchell ordered redundant tests because he'd lost a patient to a misread echocardiogram and couldn't bear to lose another. Hargrove noticed the things that threatened him. He had a talent for identifying danger in the small movements of people who were paying attention when they shouldn't be. He was in his office on the administrative floor, drinking coffee from a ceramic mug imprinted with a country club logo, when his secretary buzzed him. A call from Dr. Bennett at St. Michael's Medical. They'd been discussing the consultant pipeline, the careful cascade of phantom consultations that generated billing codes without actual consultations, the kind of invoicing that lived in the grey spaces where insurance auditors feared to look. We need to talk, Bennett said without greeting. How's your night shift coverage? Any problems? Standard staffing, Hargrove replied. He was 48 years old and had perfected the art of sounding casual while calculating margins. Why? Just heard from Mitchell that you've got a referral case coming through. Complex pericardial. Everyone's declining it. He's going to do comfort care and let the man die peacefully. Hargrove's coffee went down smoothly. That sounds appropriate. It would be, Bennett said, except Mitchell told me a nurse asked to take the case. A new nurse. 3 weeks on night shift. And she's reading every chart with a microscope. Notice some anomalies in the billing on 3 different cases already. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. What kind of anomalies? Hargrove asked. The kind that make insurance companies send investigators, Bennett said. The kind that end careers. After Bennett hung up, Hargrove sat very still in his office chair, which cost more than some people's monthly rent, and thought about the problem named Natalie Hayes. He didn't know that name yet. He didn't know anything about her except that she was new, thorough, and asking questions about the kind of money that kept his boat at the marina and his daughter's tuition paid at the private academy where they taught things like how to preserve family wealth across generations. He pulled up the staff roster on his computer. There, Hayes, NRN. Night shift. Started 19 days ago. No prior employment history listed at Oak Creek. References from 3 hospitals in 3 different cities over a span of 5 years. Someone who moved a lot. Someone who didn't stay anywhere long. Someone who was running from something. Hargrove smiled because predators recognized the hunted, and he'd been hunting in institutional spaces long enough to know the pattern. A transient nurse who asked careful questions and read charts with the kind of attention that suggested she'd been trained to notice things. Who showed up at exactly the moment his operation was becoming most profitable. He picked up his phone and made a call to the board member who owed him a favor from the renovations budget 3 years ago. Then he called the administrator who supervised RN hiring. Then he made a note in a document on his computer titled Performance Management, Hayes, and left it open on his desk for the moment when he would need it. The night shift stretched ahead. In room 407, the colonel lay in bed with the heart monitor keeping its steady rhythm, for now, while a nurse who used to be a warrior checked his vitals every 2 hours with hands that had held the rope when he was 8 years old and the world was ending. Neither of them acknowledged the recognition. Neither of them could afford to. Outside, rain began to fall on Norfolk, steady and relentless, and somewhere in the administrative offices above the ward, the machinery of institutional power began to turn against the one person who might have noticed what it was grinding away. The rain had stopped by the time Natalie clocked into the night shift, but the parking lot still smelled of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust from the loading dock. She'd survived Helmand Province, 20 years of it, tours that blurred together like photographs left in the sun, and somehow Norfolk felt harder. The colonel in room 407 was stable for now, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, and Natalie had learned long ago how to compartmentalize. One breath at a time. One shift at a time. One secret at a time. The mistake was the charts. She'd noticed the pattern 3 weeks into the job. Phantom consultations billed to insurers who'd never been called. Procedures documented that never happened. The numbers didn't match what she'd charted, what she'd actually watched happen at the bedside. A pediatric echocardiogram for a cardiac patient who'd already been discharged. A neurology consult dated 2 days before the patient arrived. The discrepancies were small, deliberate, the kind of thing that would dissolve under casual scrutiny but crystallize under auditor review. Natalie had started making copies. She wasn't looking to be a hero. She was looking to understand why a hospital that claimed to serve people was systematically stealing from the very insurance system that paid for their care. The answer had a name: Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the hospital's golden boy, 42, legacy connections, the kind of surgeon who'd learned early that charm was more profitable than competence. Friday night, the cafeteria at 2:47 a.m., skeleton crew rotating through. The kind of place where decisions got made that no one would remember in the morning. Natalie was reaching for a coffee when Hargrove's voice cut through the fluorescent hum, loud enough for the 7 other staff members scattered among the tables to hear. He pulled a $100 bill from his wallet and laid it flat on the table next to her. $20 as the Navy reject quits by Friday, he announced. His smile was a weapon. Everyone knew it worked. Anyone want action? The room didn't go silent. The room became quiet in the way that silence becomes consent. A resident Natalie recognized from rounds glanced over, then away. A nurse aide busied herself with a vending machine. One of the attending physicians actually smiled. Natalie set down her coffee. Hargrove's resident, a thin man with ambitious eyes and no backbone, was suddenly standing next to her. Later she'd understand it had been orchestrated, that Hargrove had nodded, given a signal she was trained enough to miss but her body recognized anyway. The resident's elbow caught her tray with perfect carelessness. The plastic clattered. Her meal scattered across the tile floor in a pattern that looked almost accidental. Scrambled eggs. Jell-O. A piece of wheat toast landing butter side down. Hargrove laughed. The kind of laugh that was meant to be contagious. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, and there was something in the word, the diminishment of it, the way he'd chosen it specifically, like he'd been testing which insult would stick, that made her understand he'd done this before. Many times. To people who needed the job more than dignity. Natalie took one measured breath. The tear that came was involuntary, a physical response to adrenaline that she'd fought in the Sanjin Valley and never quite mastered in peace. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let Hargrove see it. Saw his face shift, not guilt, never guilt, but satisfaction. He thought he'd broken something. Then she wiped it with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact, and said in a voice steady as a taut rope, "I've cleaned blood off runways under mortar fire, Doctor. This is just Tuesday." The words hit different in the silence. Not a defense. A statement of fact. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hymn. Hargrove's expression tightened. He wasn't used to refusal from night shift nursing staff. He wasn't used to refusal at all. His fingers drummed once against the table, a tell, the kind of microaggression she'd learned to read in men who needed control more than oxygen. She knelt and began gathering her food. The other staff watched. No one helped. No one offered. They'd learned the first rule of institutions: visibility was dangerous. Hargrove stood and walked to the door, but not before saying something to his resident, something quiet that made the younger man nod with the eagerness of a dog receiving approval. It took Natalie 30 seconds to understand what came next. By 0600 Friday morning, Hargrove was on his office phone before dawnlight touched Norfolk's skyline. 3 calls to board members. For calls to administrative staff at facilities where she'd worked before, references she'd listed on her employment application, people she'd respected. His voice was smooth, regretful, the tone of a colleague forced into difficult conversations. He mentioned erratic behavior. Insubordination. Anger management issues. He didn't lie outright. He simply contextualized the truth into something unrecognizable. By 07:30, the hospital's director of internal affairs, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who'd previously approved Hargrove's expense reports without question, received a formal request to initiate a misconduct investigation. The complaint detailed Natalie's unprofessional conduct, her failure to follow protocol, her aggressive interaction with attending physicians. Hargrove had attached documentation. Patient charts. Scheduling records. Nothing that was actually falsified, but everything presented in a way that suggested she'd been interfering, documenting too carefully, asking too many questions about procedures she wasn't authorized to question. He'd also arranged for 3 hospital investigators, men he'd been paying in modest kickbacks for 3 years, little cash payments hidden in consulting fees, to take the case. They owed him. They understood which way the wind needed to blow. By Friday afternoon, Hargrove had performed his own brilliant orchestration of institutional machinery. He'd activated the network. The board members knew to listen when he called. The references had been planted months ago. He'd checked his future carefully, understanding that someday he'd need to discard someone. The investigators were already building their file. What he didn't understand was that Natalie had spent 20 years in environments where men exactly like him had decided to eliminate problems. She recognized the pattern. She could feel the machinery engaging. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her 10-year-old daughter didn't understand why Mama came home at 1400 on a Friday afternoon, still in scrubs, still smelling like the hospital's cold institutional soap, and sat at the kitchen table with her hand shaking in a way that had nothing to do with medical shock and everything to do with survival instincts that couldn't be switched off. Mama. The child's voice was small. Confused. Did I do something wrong? The monitors in room 407 screamed first. 0300 hours. The pericardium, the fluid sac around the colonel's heart, had filled with blood. Cardiac tamponade. The heart couldn't expand. Every beat was crushing itself into smaller and smaller space. The alarm shrieked. Then flatlined. The code team froze in the hallway. 20 physicians. All of them stood motionless outside the colonel's room, watching the flatline spike across the monitor station. None of them moved. The resident glanced at the attending cardiologist. The attending looked at the chief. Nobody stepped toward the door. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to the silence below. One doctor spoke. High-risk case. Malpractice exposure if we intervene and it goes wrong. Another nodded. Already 20 of us on the refusal list. Not adding my signature to that. They had 20 reasons not to go in. 20 was the magic number, the threshold where no single physician felt responsible. When 20 doctors say no, the responsibility dissolves into percentages and committee discussions and conversations with legal teams that never happened. The colonel's oxygen saturation was dropping. 68, the monitor tone descended like a falling bomb. Natalie moved. She didn't run. She walked past the frozen attending cardiologist with a stride like someone carrying classified orders. The voice wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. Moving in. Out of the way. The 20 doctors parted without thinking. Something in her movement, the weight of it, the absolute certainty, cut through the paralysis like a hot wire through silk. She was already gloved, already moving, the 4 kit in her hand because she had anticipated this 40 minutes ago when she saw the fluid build up on the echo and watched every physician in the hospital find a reason to be somewhere else. The colonel lay unconscious, his chest heaving, his body in the final seconds of a fight his heart was losing. Natalie's hands moved on their own. 1,000 meters away. Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province. An 8-year-old boy pinned under concrete rubble, his small chest crushed, bleeding internally with nothing but a field dressing kit and her. No surgical team. No hospital. Just her hands and what her hands remembered from the combat medic course and 16 years of field trauma that carved itself into muscle memory like calluses that never fade. Pain is data. Pressure is information. The body tells you what it needs if you listen without trembling. She felt for the fourth and fifth intercostal spaces. Midclavicular line. The needle was a 14-gauge angiocath, long enough to reach through the chest wall into the fluid sac. Her left hand was already positioning the ultrasound probe, one hand steering, one hand ready. The probe showed her the dark fluid pooling around the heart. The echo of his own blood drowning him. Point-of-care ultrasound confirms hemopericardium, she said, and 2 residents flinched at the terminology. Hemopericardium. Not the word a night nurse used. The word a field trauma surgeon used. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle. Slow. Controlled. The colonel's body jerked as she advanced past skin, past fascia, into the fluid-filled sac. The hiss of air escaping. Blood flowed backward through the syringe like she was pulling out his drowning. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered from the hallway. 75, the oxygen saturation climbed. 82. She drew back steadily, draining the accumulated blood from the pericardium. The heart expanded with each withdrawal. The monitor tone changed. 1 beat. Then 2. The wave pattern steadied like a metronome finding its rhythm. 88. 92, stable. The colonel's eyes opened. Confusion first. Then clarity. He was looking at her, and his eyes held a question that had no answer in this room. Not yet. 20 physicians stood in the hallway watching a woman in scrubs perform a procedure they had all decided was too risky. Their hands were still in their pockets. Her hands were already wrapping gauze around the needle site, her movements economical, her breathing unchanged. Not a single tremor. Not a single hesitation. Hargrove stood at the far end of the corridor, half hidden behind the supply cart. He was already making calls. The phone was already at his ear. His jaw was tight, the kind of tight that comes when a calculated risk goes wrong. She had performed a procedure under duress with 20 physicians as witnesses. She had demonstrated knowledge she shouldn't possess. She had revealed something. His fingers worked his phone screen before she even finished securing the dressing. Board members. Investigators. References. The network activated like an organism with instincts for its own survival. By dawn, the narrative would shift. High-risk procedure performed without authorization. Scope of practice violation. Negligence that could have killed the patient if not for luck. 20 doctors refused the case for legal reasons. She performed it anyway. That asymmetry had to be corrected. Had to be weaponized. Natalie didn't know he was calling. She was watching the colonel's chest rise and fall in synchronized rhythm with the ventilator. The tattoo on her left inner wrist, a date in faded blue ink, coordinates from Helmand Province, pressed against the inside of her sleeve as she worked. 20 years and she still felt that memory burning like fresh scar tissue. This boy. This child pulled from rubble. Now a colonel. Now alive because 20 physicians had the good sense to be afraid and she had the bad sense to remember that fear was a luxury she had never afforded herself. The colonel's eyes found hers again. Recognition flickered. Something ancient and shared lived in that single look. "You saved me," he said. The voice was weak. The certainty was absolute. "Pericardial fluid was compressing your heart," she replied. Standard. Clinical. The voice of someone who had never pulled a boy from concrete with her bare hands 20 years prior. Tension tamponade. "You're stable now." But the way she said it, without inflection, without the warmth a normal nurse would include, with the precision of someone delivering a casualty report to a command center, made the 20 doctors in the hallway understand that they had just witnessed something they would never be able to explain to a malpractice lawyer. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, the first drops against the windows like artillery beginning. Hargrove made the calls before sunrise. By 6:08 a.m., the hospital administrator's phone was ringing. The board member in purchasing. The chief of credentials. a retired judge who served on the ethics committee and owed Hargrove favors from a real estate deal 15 years prior. Each conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes. Each one ended the same way: "She's a liability. I have documentation." He didn't mention the pericardiocentesis. He didn't mention that she'd saved a life that 20 board-certified physicians had collectively decided was too high risk for their malpractice coverage. Instead, he talked about protocol violations, unauthorized medical intervention, a nurse stepping outside her scope of practice. The language was precise, legalistic, designed to sound official rather than vengeful. By 8:13 a.m., 3 hospital investigators arrived at Oak Creek Memorial carrying a file folder that was thicker than it should have been. Hargrove had worked fast. He'd pulled her personnel file, the original one from her hiring paperwork with the name she'd given, the name that wasn't hers, the one she'd built a new life under. He'd photocopied her shift schedule from the week before. He'd flagged 7 separate entries in a nursing log where she'd documented patient observations that, taken out of context, looked like she was overstepping her authority. Then he'd done something darker. He'd forged her credentials verification. A single page, official-looking, stamped and dated, claiming that her licensure had expired 6 months prior and she'd failed to renew. It was a lie constructed so carefully that it would take 3 days to unravel. By then, the narrative would already be set. She would already be finished. The investigators called her into a conference room at 9:22 a.m. The head of hospital compliance, a woman named Richardson who had never met Natalie before, sat across from her with the file open. Richardson's hands trembled as she read from the first page. "These are serious allegations, Miss Hayes. Practicing without valid credentials. Unauthorized medical procedures. Deviation from established protocols." Natalie sat very still. The fluorescent light above them flickered once. She said nothing. "Your RN licensure expired in March," Richardson continued, her voice climbing slightly. "You continue to work a full schedule. That's fraud." "No," Natalie said. One word. "Flat. My renewal is current. You can verify with the Virginia Board of Nursing within an hour." Richardson's face paled. She'd been handed the forged document by Hargrove's investigator and had not questioned it. Now doubt cracked across her features like ice on a winter road. But the folder was open in front of her, and there were 5 other pages underneath, and the machine had already been set in motion. "Regardless," she said, her voice smaller now, "the matter of unauthorized medical intervention remains. You performed a procedure that only physicians are permitted to perform." "The patient was in cardiac arrest," Natalie replied. Her voice did not rise. It did not tremble. It sounded like someone reading a casualty report to a command center. 20 physicians declined to treat. The patient was dead without intervention. A nurse in that situation has a duty to act. Richardson shifted in her chair. She was not cruel. She was simply following the script that had been written for her. "Nevertheless, we have a responsibility to investigate. During that investigation, you are suspended pending the outcome of our review. Effective immediately." Natalie did not argue. She did not cry. She did not ask about her shift schedule or her medical benefits or any of the small practical questions that women in her situation usually asked. Instead, she stood up, unbuttoned her hospital ID from her scrub top, and set it on the table. "How long?" she asked. 2 to 4 weeks, Richardson said. "Possibly longer." Natalie walked out of the conference room at 9:38 a.m. She went to her locker in the nurse's station. The boots were there, just as they always were, the worn pair she'd kept from her last deployment, the ones with the desert dust still caught in the eyelets even though she'd washed them 100 times. Combat boots from a war zone half a world away, the only military item she'd kept when she'd walked away from everything. She reached for them, and her hand hesitated. Those boots were evidence now. Tagged. Catalogued in Hargrove's fabricated disciplinary file as proof of her unprofessional behavior. A nurse keeping military gear in a hospital locker. Such a small thing. Such a stupid, damning thing. She gathered her belongings into a paper bag. The spare scrubs. The lip balm. The 3 protein bars she'd been saving for a night shift that would never come. The boots went in last. The drive home took 22 minutes. Natalie's hands never shook on the steering wheel. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She simply drove through Norfolk in the morning traffic like a person who had no other place to be and no particular reason to arrive. Her daughter was at the kitchen table when she walked in. Emma, 10 years old, with Natalie's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, sitting in her school uniform with her backpack beside her, confusion spreading across her face like spilled milk. Mama. Emma's voice was small. Uncertain. Why are you home? It's not even 10 a.m. You work nights. Why are you home? Natalie set the paper bag on the counter. The boots made a soft thud when they settled. She sat down across from her daughter, and for the first time that morning, something cracked inside her chest. Did I do something wrong? Emma asked, and that question, asked in the voice of a child who had learned to blame herself for the arbitrary cruelties of the world, broke her completely. Natalie's eyes filled with tears. Not one tear that she could wipe away with dignity. A flood. She buried her face in her hands and cried like a woman who had survived 20 years of service only to discover that survival meant nothing. That honor meant nothing. That the rules she'd followed her entire life could be erased by a man who had wanted her gone before sunrise. No, baby, she whispered through her hands. No. You didn't do anything wrong. Mama Mama is having a difficult day. Emma got up from the table and pressed herself against Natalie's shoulder, small and scared and unable to understand why the strongest person she knew was falling apart in front of her. Natalie held her daughter. She did not explain the injustice. She did not tell Emma about Hargrove or the forged document or the fabricated file. She simply held her and let herself break for exactly 5 minutes while the morning light moved across the kitchen table and the silence pressed down like a physical weight. Outside, Norfolk was going about its business. Oak Creek Memorial was processing the next patient. Hargrove was already taking calls about her replacement. The machine had moved on. The machinery of institutions was indifferent to one nurse's fall. That night, Natalie lay awake in the dark next to her sleeping daughter. Emma was curled against her, thumb in her mouth the way she hadn't done in years, a regression born from feeling her mother's fear even if she couldn't name it. Natalie stared at the ceiling and did the math. Her savings would last 5 weeks if she was careful. After that, there would be no money. No health insurance. No explanation she could offer to anyone about why a decorated nurse had simply vanished from the workforce. She thought about the combat boots still in the paper bag on the kitchen counter. She thought about calling her sister, who lived in Richmond and had never known where Natalie had gone or why she'd come back as a different person wearing a different name. She thought about admitting the truth, that she'd been someone once, someone important, someone who'd carried weight and made decisions that mattered, and that she'd given all of it up to escape the sound of helicopter rotors and the smell of desert dust and the feeling of blood on her hands. The thing she didn't know, as she lay in the dark beside her sleeping daughter, was that in room 407 at Oak Creek Memorial, the colonel who had survived the pericardiocentesis was waking up. His first words, barely a whisper through the oxygen mask, were directed at the night nurse checking his vital signs. Where is she? The night nurse didn't understand. Where is who, sir? The one who saved me, the colonel said. His voice was stronger now, the medication and rest restoring something that the 20 refusing physicians had declared irretrievable. The nurse. Where is she? It was a simple question. It would create a simple answer. And that answer would change everything that came after. Friday morning arrived at Oak Creek Memorial like an announcement nobody wanted to hear. The rotor wash from the Black Hawk shook the windows of the administrative floor before boots hit the tarmac. 23 minutes later, a Marine officer stood in the hallway outside the chief administrator's office, his presence making the fluorescent lights seem somehow dimmer. His voice carried the weight of command, not loud, just inevitable. "We're here for Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Now." The room went dead silent. Security looked at the administrator. The administrator looked at his computer screen where Natalie's suspension file sat open, flagged in red. Nobody moved. The Marine repeated himself, and this time he didn't ask. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. This facility has 60 seconds to produce her or we secure this building." In room 407, Colonel James Chen lay propped on pillows, oxygen cannula at his nose, color returning to his face in shades that hadn't been there yesterday. His eyes were clear, lucid. When the chief administrator rushed in, panic barely contained behind a forced smile, the colonel's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "That nurse." He pointed down the hallway. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. She holds the rank. She outranks every physician in this building." The administrator's hands trembled as he pulled up the military file on his tablet. His fingers moved in slow motion, typing credentials into the system, and what emerged on the screen made him sit down without asking permission. 3 deployments. Helmand Province. Field Trauma Specialist Certification Level 4. Combat Medic with Advanced Trauma Protocols. The administrator's voice came out barely a whisper. "That's not possible." Down the hallway, a SEAL team leader stepped forward. His name was Mitchell, and his uniform bore patches that marked him as someone who'd seen things most people spend their entire lives trying to forget. He spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to speaking in situations where words meant life or death. "Senior Chief Hayes served under my command. Helmand Province, 2007 through 2015. She specialized in field extraction trauma, lives saved under fire when extraction was impossible." He paused. Let the weight of that settle. Bronze Star. The administrator's eyes went wider. Mitchell continued, each decoration its own sentence, each one hitting like a physical force. Silver Star. The security guard swallowed hard. 2 Purple Hearts. Someone in the hallway gasped. Then Mitchell's voice dropped even lower. "And a Navy Cross. That's 2, actually. 2 Navy Crosses. Which means she's held lives together in circumstances that would make most people's hands shake so badly they couldn't function." Hargrove stood frozen in his office doorway, 40 feet away. He'd been watching this unfold from behind glass, and every second that passed was a second his world was contracting. 23 hours ago, he'd filed the forged personnel records with the hospital's disciplinary committee. False performance reviews. Fabricated patient complaints. Documents with altered timestamps designed to justify the suspension and clear the way for termination. He'd done it in his private office with the door locked, using a notary seal he'd purchased through an offshore supplier and a printer he kept specifically for this purpose. The files had been uploaded to the hospital's mainframe at 03 for 7 hours, time to ensure discovery after shift change when documentation trails grew murkier. But federal agents don't move on hospital time. The woman who stepped out of the Marine convoy held herself with the kind of quiet that only comes from having survived things that should have ended differently. Natalie's uniform was Class A dress, navy dress blues she'd kept in a cedar chest for nearly 2 decades, pressed and maintained and hidden. The fabric still fit like it had been tailored yesterday. Her ribbons aligned in perfect rows. Her insignia caught the morning light. Hargrove's phone rang at 08 for 1 hours. The voice on the other end identified itself as Special Agent Patricia Cross, Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was calling to inform him that an investigation into wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit falsification of medical records had been opened at the federal level. She was asking him to remain on hospital premises pending formal interview. She was being very polite about it. By 08:47 hours, handcuffs were clicking into place. The sound echoed down the hallway like a closing parenthesis. FBI agents flanked him, 1 on each side, professional and unmoved by the way his face drained to the color of old gauze. His tailored suit suddenly looked like a costume. His watch caught light as they walked him toward the elevator, past the nurse's station, past the room where the colonel watched from his bed, oxygen in his nose and tears in his eyes as he saw the woman who'd saved his life all those years ago finally stand in the light she should have occupied all along. The perp walk was captured on 3 separate angles: security cameras, someone's phone, and a news crew that had been tipped off by a Marine public affairs officer who understood the power of narrative timing. Hargrove's face went on camera looking shocked, then furious, then something that looked like a person realizing they'd miscalculated in every possible way. The charges were read with precision. Wire fraud. Insurance fraud. Conspiracy. Falsification of medical records. Theft by deception. His attorney arrived 14 minutes later, looking expensive and deeply exhausted. 2 years passed like an exhale. Oak Creek Memorial underwent reconstruction. The trauma wing got rebuilt with a $7 million investment and new protocols that prioritized patient outcomes over liability fears. The hospital board announced the establishment of the Hayes Trauma Fellowship, competitive, demanding, designed to train the next generation of providers who understood that some patients were worth fighting for even when the statistics said they shouldn't be. On the wall of the rebuilt trauma wing, a glass case held a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was creased and scarred. The sole showed patterns of wear that told the story of thousands of miles across terrain that broke ordinary equipment. Beneath the boots, a brass plaque read in letters that caught light like acknowledgement, Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. The 21st Doctor. Helmet off to those who understand that the greatest measure of a life is not the recognition we receive, but the lives we save when nobody is watching. As for Hargrove, a news crew spotted him outside a strip mall in suburban Virginia 6 months after conviction. He was selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table, the kind that stood in front of a discount dental clinic next to a tax preparation service. His name tag read Steve. Just Steve. No title. No credentials. People who recognized him would sometimes call him doctor anyway, and each time his entire body would stiffen. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the recognition of diminishment. The understanding that power built on fraud lasts exactly as long as the fraud holds up under scrutiny, which is to say, not long at all. But what about Natalie? She turned down the position as chief of trauma. She turned down the 6-figure salary and the administrative title and the office with windows overlooking the bay. On her first morning back at Oak Creek, back not as an employee returning from suspension, but as Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, reinstated with full honors and a formal apology from hospital leadership, she put on scrubs instead of dress blues. Blue scrubs. Navy blue, actually. The ones that let her move without restriction, that had pockets deep enough for trauma shears and a penlight and the small things that kept people alive. She walked into Ward 4 at 0600 hours, ready to work the night shift, and the nurses there, the ones who'd watched her perform emergency pericardiocentesis from muscle memory, the ones who'd learned she was something more than just a nurse, they understood. She wasn't there for the title. She was there for the work. The colonel recovered fully. His cardiac function normalized. His prognosis shifted from terminal to excellent. And when Natalie checked his vitals on what would be his final morning before discharge, he reached out and held her hand, not as a commander, not as a patient, but as a son who'd finally found his way home to the woman who'd pulled him from rubble 2 decades ago and never let him go. They didn't speak. Some things don't need words. His daughter Emma, now 12 years old, stood in the doorway and understood for the first time that her mother carried the weight of more than one life, and that some people don't become heroes because they're looking for recognition. They become heroes because someone has to, and they're the only ones willing to do the work. The night shift resumed. Patients came through the doors. Monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm. And in a hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, where 20 doctors had once walked away from a case they deemed too complicated, a nurse with a Navy Cross under her scrubs proved what should have been obvious all along: sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.